As the director of the John Adams Institute, I'm happy to welcome all of you here tonight, and a special welcome to Mr. Irving, Mrs. Irving, and Pieter Steinz. It's an honor and a great privilege, Mr. Irving, to have you as our guest tonight in our series American Literature Today. We thought this church would be big enough for everyone who wanted to meet Mr. Irving. But apparently, it's not. We could have sold 3 times as many tickets. We planned to build a comfortable podium here in front, but the interest was so great that we had to relegate Mr. Irving and Mr. Steinz to the pulpit. The evening will begin with a short introduction by Pieter Steinz, literary critic and arts editor for NRC Handelsblad. After his introduction, Mr. Steinz will give the floor, rather the pulpit, to Mr. Irving. There will be no intermission. That would take too much time. Besides, on page 627 of A Son of the Circus, recently published by Antos, Mr. Irving writes that the best readings are those without intermissions. After Mr. Irving's reading, there will be a discussion between Mr. Irving and Mr. Steinz, after which the audience will be given the opportunity to participate. However, there are no microphones in this room. The acoustics are good. If you speak slowly and loudly, your voice will carry to the pulpit. The evening will conclude a little before 10 o'clock, we hope, after which Mr. Irving will be available to sign books here. Enjoy your evening. Thank you. Pieter?
The John Adams Institute has asked me to introduce John Irving. But what is there to introduce about a writer who is so well known as John Irving? John Irving is probably the most popular American author who was ever invited to Holland. You could say that he's a pop star. Let me give you a few examples. The average American writer comes to Holland and gives a reading for 100 or 200 people in a little room, a friendly little room. John Irving sells out this church easily and could have sold out the big theater Carré, a place which would have been a good place for John Irving since his last novel is called The Son of the Circus. The average American writer comes to Holland and may consider himself lucky when he finds his new novel in the windows of 1 or 2 bookshops. John Irving not only sees his new novel everywhere, he also sees 4 different editions of it. The American one, the English one, the Dutch translation, and some kind of novelty, a Dutch one in English. That's a world record. One could say that publishers really fight for the right to publish John Irving. And finally, the average American writer comes to Holland and does a handful of interviews in a week or so. John Irving does about 5 a day and still finds the time to be here tonight. It's a good thing that he's in good shape, that there is a fitness center close to his hotel, in which it is said he trains every day. In short, John Irving is a household name, and most of you know him and his work very well. But for the 1 or 2 people who came to this church tonight unexpectedly, hoping to hear a sermon or something like that, I'll give a little bit of information. First, about his life. John Irving was born in 1942 in Exeter, New Hampshire. In interviews, he likes to stress that he's very much a New Englander. He's a Puritan at heart, a man who's addicted to working hard and consequently writes big novels. Books which often deal with sin and punishment and guilt, the great themes of Puritan 19th century writers like Herman Melville or Nathaniel Hawthorne. John Irving went to university in 1961, mainly to do two things, as he says, to wrestle and to write. During his studies, he went on an exchange program to Vienna, and the reason I say that is, of course, that it turns up in some of his novels. City that is in Garp and in the Hotel New Hampshire. At the famous writers' workshop in Iowa City, at the University of Iowa, Irving wrote his first novel, Setting Free the Bears, about Vienna. It is a picaresque novel about a plot to set free all the animals in the Viennese zoo. Two things from this novel came back in his later work. The bears, of course, which are everywhere in some of his novels, and then again, Vienna. In 1971, John Irving made his literary and commercial breakthrough with Garp, his moving novel about a writer who grows up in the daily madness of post-war America. It was an extremely funny book and an extremely sad one, a great American novel about the harsh reality of American life. After Garp, John Irving wrote four more novels and became the household name I was talking about. The last of these is A Son of the Circus, of which we will talk tonight, and he will read from it. Enough of John Irving's life. Let us speak a little bit about his work. What kind of a writer is John Irving? The most important thing to say about him is that he is in many ways a good old-fashioned novelist, a man who loves to tell a good story. No wonder he's proud of the fact that he's called an entertainer. John Irving considers himself to be a writer in the tradition of 19th century storytellers, like Thomas Hardy, the Bronte sisters, and, of course, one shouldn't forget him, Charles Dickens. It is Charles Dickens who is John Irving's hero. As he once said, Great Expectations, a novel by Charles Dickens about the little orphan Pip, is the book that made me want to be a novelist. And the ghost of Charles Dickens is indeed very much in the books of John Irving. One recognizes his English example in many things. The intricate plots with many sidelines and many events that at first seem crazy, but at the end of the book all come together. There's the famous quote by Anton Chekhov, if there is a gun in Act 1, make sure that the gun is fired in Act 3, or whatever act it should be, at the end at least. You could say something like that about John Irving. In A Son of the Circus, there is a crow in an early chapter, and it leaves a piece of evidence that can be used in the outcome. That's a sort of Chekhov thing in John Irving. The second thing that is very much Dickens in Irving are the eccentric and unforgettable side figures that people all these novels. There is the transsexual football player Roberta Muldoon from Garp. There is a woman in a bear suit in the Hotel New Hampshire. And there is an actor who's so absorbed with his role that he speaks in film dialogue. That is, of course, from his latest novel. And in A Son of the Circus, even a relatively normal figure like Dr. Daruwalla writes violent film scripts and collects the blood of circus dwarfs. The last things in which you see Dickens are small things, like the background of some of the main characters. As in Dickens, there are many orphans or semi-orphans in the work of John Irving. And you see it in the almost Victorian morality in the books. The bad is punished and the good is rewarded. Irving is a good old-fashioned novelist, but that doesn't mean he's old-fashioned. His novels are often about topical subjects. There are the dangers of sexual revolution in Garp. There's the importance of free abortion in the Ciderhouse Rules. And there is a big theme, the degeneration of America, in A Prayer for Owen Meany. And this may sound all very serious, but I should say that Irving is first and foremost a very funny writer. He can write passages which makes you laugh aloud. Think of the Garp bit bonky bit from The World According to Garp. Or Owen Meany playing the baby Christ in a Christmas play. And next to that, there are passages, and those are especially at the end of almost every Irving book, that really make you want to cry. All in all, one can say that the writer John Irving is a number of things at the same time. He is an athlete. He's a Puritan. He's a good old-fashioned novelist. He's an entertainer. He's a fan of Dickens. He's an engaged writer. He's a funny and a moving author. And as I know from the time I interviewed him in his home in Vermont, he's probably the best salad maker in southern Vermont. Tonight, we will learn which of these John Irvings will be here. I give the floor over to him.
The last time I gave a reading in a church, I brought only one excerpt of a new novel to read from. I didn't know I was going to read in a church. And unfortunately, the excerpt I brought was about a dildo. This time I knew in advance I was reading in a church. So I brought something that's a little more appropriate. I want to talk a little bit about the beginnings of novels in general, and this new one in particular. Novels don't always begin the same way for me. What gets them started isn't always the same thing. But all 8 of them have this in common. I don't start writing until I see the end of the story. I have to see something that feels like an ending before I can even imagine where you, the reader, should enter the story. And so I spend often a year, sometimes more than a year, just taking notes. I spend a lot more time before I begin the novel than I do writing the first draft. And then I spend more time revising the novel than I spend writing the first draft. It takes a long time to begin at the ending and work your way back to the beginning. But I just don't know another way to do it, so I'm slow. In the case of The World According to Garp, I was struck by what I call now the sexual polarization in the United States, that men and women were growing aggressively, even violently, apart. And so I thought of a story in which a mother, a single mother, is murdered by a man who hates women, and her son is murdered by a woman who hates men. And the first sentence I wrote down was, in the world according to Garp, we are all terminal cases. I had the idea right, but it wasn't the first sentence. It became, after a couple of months, the first sentence of the second chapter. And then I moved it to be the first sentence of the third chapter and the fourth chapter. And finally, as some of you may remember, it became the last sentence of the last chapter. This was my fourth book, but it took me, I think, this long to realize that I begin at the end. I'm not sure that I was fully conscious of that before that a moment in time. A prayer for Owen Meany was relatively simple. I knew a very small boy when I was growing up, at a time when I was also very small. Maybe we were both 8 or 9 years old. But he was a full head shorter than everybody else. And about the time I was 10 or 11, his family moved away from town, and the boy went with them. I never saw him again. And many years after that, after the Vietnam War, I was sitting with some friends, some of whom had been in Vietnam, some of whom had not been in Vietnam, and we started making one of those morbid lists that people of my generation do. We started to put together a list of people we knew who'd been killed in Vietnam or whose lives had been virtually destroyed because of Vietnam, sometimes because they didn't go. And we put together this list of names that we all knew, people we'd gone to school with and grown up with. And somebody mentioned this little boy's name, and I couldn't even remember who he was. I didn't put the name with the body. And someone said, "Oh, don't you know, he moved away, but he was that really little guy, and he was killed in Vietnam." And I said, stupidly, "But how was he big enough to go to Vietnam?" Forgetting that he probably grew. But from that point in time, I began to imagine someone who didn't grow. And from the very beginning, I wanted you, the reader, to think that you knew what the story was before you read the story. Namely, someone's best friend has been killed in Vietnam, and he is writing the story from Canada, where he has run away from the draft. And you're supposed to think that for about 400 pages. Because it always mattered to me that Owen Meany be a victim of the Vietnam War, but that he be killed in the United States by another American. And that the man who's remembering him and telling the story has not run away to Canada to evade the draft. He doesn't have to run away. Because Owen Meany cuts his finger off, he could stay in the United States forever and nobody would take him. He runs away because he hates the United States. That's a big difference. And when I made this outline and when I structured the book in this way, I never realized that I was making a trap for reviewers, that I was making a trap for lazy reviewers who never read the book. I never realized before how many book reviewers there were who don't finish the book. Because 24, I'm not kidding, 24, 36 times I read reviews which said, this is a novel about a guy who's killed in Vietnam, told by a guy who runs away to Canada. And you knew exactly how far they got, or how far they didn't get. But it's now perhaps more relevant to talk about this new one. Owen Meany had not been published, but I was finished the book and thinking about what I might do next. I was thinking of a novel about a widow, which is what I'm thinking about now, 5.5 years later. But I hadn't gotten very far with that story. And my wife and I were going home to our Toronto apartment. We'd been out to dinner. And it was late at night. It was Christmas time, 1988. And I saw a man on the corner of the street. Our taxi was stopped at a traffic light. And he was also waiting for the light to change so that he could walk across the street. He was very well dressed, much too well dressed to be a writer. He was about 10 years older than I am, early 60s, I'm guessing. Very distinguished looking. And he was clearly from India or the Middle East. He was a man with a dark skin, but how dark in the light was hard to tell. He was clearly not a fifth-generation Canadian. He was what the newspapers in North America call an immigrant of color, a phrase that the main character of this novel is very sensitive to. And he looked, by his appearance, very successfully assimilated in his new country. And I found myself simply imagining that I could never know the richness of everything that was foreign where he'd come from, that the world he'd come from was closed to me, and probably a world that was inexpressible for him, unless he was an artist or a writer, and he didn't look like one. And at the same time, I realized I was being rude. I was staring at him. And I'd made him uncomfortable. He was anxious about me. He stepped a little bit back from the curb. He turned his back a little bit to me. And suddenly I felt that his discomfort was probably racial, that he was afraid I was one of those people who was going to roll down the window and say something ugly to him. Probably because people had. Probably because this had happened to him before. Just that. And then the light changed, and in less time than it's taken me to tell you this, he was gone. And I couldn't get him out of my head. I thought that he was very near the end of a novel. And that the end of the novel, the proper end of the novel would be if you, the reader, knew everything that was foreign about him, if you knew everything about where he'd come from and all the foreign background that had been in his past, everyone he'd known, everyone he'd met, everything that had brought him to the corner of the street with the snow falling, and that he was a very decent and very sympathetic man. And you knew that. But at the moment you know this, you have to see how he appears in the eyes of a stranger. Someone else is going to see him through their eyes, and they don't know him. They have all of the racial mistrust of foreigners that is common among us all, not only in North America. They have all of the suspicion and fear of the foreign and fear of the different that is with our society everywhere. And that in the eyes of that person, he is threatening. He is someone to be afraid of. Although we know that of all the people in the city of Toronto, which is a very multicultural city, 40% immigrants, this is the one man in Toronto that this person has no reason to fear. And I thought that that moment of misunderstanding would be a little painful, a little uncomfortable. And it felt like the end of the story of someone's life. If, of course, I could fill in everything that happened before the moment of him standing there in the snow. And so I began speaking to many of my Indian friends about such a man whose foreignness traveled with him. When he went home to India, he wasn't at home. When he came back to North America, he didn't feel at home there. And most of my Indian friends said, so what's different about him? So what's new? So what's interesting? And I realized that it was something common that many of them had felt before, and with considerable help from them, more than a year later, I went to Bombay. When I went with a shopping list. I went with a grocery list. By that time I had the story, and so I knew what I didn't know. I knew what I needed to see, what hours of the day and night I needed to be in this police station, in that hospital, with this circus, in this club, in that brothel. I had the map of the landscape of the story because by then the characters were present. And it was about a year. About a year after that, about a year after I came back from India, I wrote the beginning. Beginnings come last. You see, it's just turned around for me. The beginning is the last thing I come to. And so here's the first paragraph. Usually the dwarfs kept bringing him back to the circus and back to India. The doctor was familiar with the feeling of leaving Bombay for the last time. Almost every time he left India, he vowed that he'd never come back. Then the years would pass, as a rule not more than 4 or 5, and once again he'd be taking the long flight from Toronto. That he was born in Bombay was not the reason. At least this was what the doctor claimed. Both his mother and father were dead. His sister lived in London, his brother in Zurich. The doctor's wife was Austrian, and their children and grandchildren lived in England and in Canada. None of them wanted to live in India. They rarely visited the country, nor had a single one of them been born there. But the doctor was fated to go back to Bombay. He would keep returning again and again, if not forever, at least for as long as there were dwarfs in the circus. The doctor has a hobby, and he fools himself that his hobby is what keeps bringing him back. Because every time he goes back to India, he feels he belongs there less than he did the last time he went. He's more depressed when he comes back to North America. It's not his country anymore. And yet he kids himself for the duration of this story that it is his interest in finding a genetic marker for a certain kind of dwarfism that brings him back. He takes blood from dwarfs, achondroplastic dwarfs. Achondroplasia is the most common type of so-called short-limbed dwarfism. And these dwarfs comprise the majority of circus clowns in India. These are the dwarfs whose blood he takes. He's told by his geneticist friends that it's a stupid mission. The doctor is an orthopedic surgeon. He's not a geneticist. It is strictly a hobby that makes him think he can find this defective gene. Because this kind of dwarfism is the result of a so-called spontaneous mutation. Very hard to find, very hard to spot. Normal parents with no history of dwarfism produce a dwarf. Those parents will never produce a dwarf again. But that dwarf has a 50% chance of producing other dwarfs. It becomes a dominant characteristic in his children. Genetically, it's a labyrinth. The doctor is aware it's a needle in a haystack kind of search. And I begin with this story because at the end of the novel, the dwarf who is his closest friend among dwarfs is dead, and the doctor has given up his search for this gene. He's put it aside, and he's recognizing that he's still going to go back to India, that the reason he goes back to India is that he was born there, and he'll always go back, and it has nothing to do with the dwarfs. The first section of the book, therefore, is called Blood from Dwarfs. The last section of the book is called Not the Dwarfs. So that there's a symmetry from the beginning. I had a pleasant surprise. 2 weeks after I finished proofreading the book, someone discovered the gene for this kind of dwarfism. When you live with a character for 5.5 years, he becomes closer to you than the people you know. And my first thought was how happy I was for Dr. Daruwalla. I didn't think about the book. I just thought how pleased Dr. Daruwalla would have been that even if he couldn't find the defective gene, the genetic marker, someone else had found it. It made him, to me, less foolish than for all of his life he'd been led to believe. I also had a very strange letter at that time from the researcher at the University of California who discovered the gene. He'd been reading A Son of the Circus, and he wrote to tell me that he thought I knew more about dwarfs than he did, because until he made the discovery, he never met a dwarf. He was a biologist, and all he'd been doing is looking at the blood. In fact, it was a very lucky discovery. No one was looking for achondroplasia. They were looking for something else. And in the course of looking for something else, the defective gene for achondroplasia popped out at them, and someone said, "What's that? Looks like a dwarf." And that's how they find it. This is true. I'm not making this up. This is true. Everyone thinks I make up everything, but I don't. It's true. So I'm very happy for my doctor and for the doctor in California who's made this discovery. I'm going to read a very short excerpt from the first chapter of the book. It's an atmospheric sort of piece about one of the places where Dr. Farrokh Daruwall hides in when he goes to Bombay. As someone who lives in North America most of the time, as a man who left India when he was very young and was educated in Europe and is married to a European woman, He's a Canadian citizen. The doctor needs places to go in Bombay that protect him from all the things he's frightened of and feels overwhelmed by when he's in India. And I knew that one of those places in his life would be a private club, and so one of the pieces of my shopping list when I went to Bombay was I had to familiarize myself with the life of some of these clubs, and the club I chose as a model for the club in the novel is one that's perhaps familiar to those of you who know Bombay better than I do. The real club is called the Willingdon Club, and it is named after Lord Willingdon, the former governor of Maharashtra and the founder of the Willingdon Club. Lord Willingdon, however, is best known for his wife, who had a pathetic vice. Poor Lady Willingdon was a kleptomaniac, and the stories about her in Bombay are quite notorious. She stole mostly from the Willingdon Club, which doubtless was an embarrassment to Lord Willingdon, whose job then became finding the things his wife had stolen so that he could return them to the club. And when I was there and looking at her magnificent portrait, I began to think that this was a very sad minor vice for an elegant woman to have, that one should be able to have a more charming vice than kleptomania if you were going to be the wife of the founder of a club. I mean, it would be embarrassing for you, wouldn't it, if your mother were a kleptomaniac and you were always getting phone calls from department stores and would you please come get your mother, that kind of thing. And so I changed her name from Willingdon to Duckworth, and I made her an exhibitionist. Exhibitionism is a much more charming sort of disease than kleptomania. I hope that Lady Willingdon would approve. It was the week between Christmas and New Year's. The weather in Bombay was uncommonly cool and dry. The active membership of the Duckworth Sports Club had reached 6,000. Considering that there was a 22-year waiting list for new members, this number had been rather gradually achieved. That morning there was a meeting of the membership committee. The distinguished Canadian surgeon, Dr. Farrokh Daruwall, was guest chairman, to determine whether member number 6,000 should receive any special notification of his extraordinary status. The suggestions ranged from a plaque in the snooker room where there were sizable gaps among the trophies, to a small reception in the ladies' garden where the usual bloom of the bougainvillea was diminished by an undiagnosed blight, to a simple typewritten memo thumbtacked alongside the list of temporarily elected members. Farrokh had often objected to the title of this list, which was posted in a locked glass case in the foyer of the Duckworth Club. He complained that temporarily elected meant merely nominated. They weren't elected at all. But this term had been the accepted usage since the club had been founded 130 years ago. A spider crouched beside the short column of names. It had crouched there for so long it was presumed dead, or perhaps the spider was also seeking permanent membership. This was Dr. Daruwalla's joke, but the joke was old. It was rumored to have been repeated by all 6,000 members. It was mid-morning, and the committee men were drinking thumbs-up cola and Gold Spot orange soda in the card room when Dr. Daruwalla suggested that the matter be dropped. "Stopped," said Mr. Dua, who was deaf in one ear, from a tennis injury, never to be forgotten. His doubles partner had double-faulted and flung his racket. Since he was only temporarily elected at the time, this shocking display of bad temper had put an end to the partner's request for permanent membership. "I move," Dr. Daruwalla now shouted, "that member number 6000 not be notified." The motion was quickly seconded and passed. Not even so much as a typewritten memo would announce the event. Dr. Sorabji, Farrokh's colleague at the Hospital for Crippled Children, said facetiously that the decision was among the wisest ever made by the membership committee. In truth, Dr. Daruwalla thought, no one wanted to risk disturbing the spider. When the committee meeting disbanded in characteristic and desultory laughter, Mr. Banerjee went seeking Mr. Lal in the men's dressing room. Dr. Sorabji went off to the hospital for office calls. Mr. Dua, whose deafness somehow suited his retirement from the percussiveness of the tire business, wandered into the snooker room to have a crack at some innocent balls, which he would barely hear. Others stayed where they were, turning to the ready decks of cards, or else they found comfort in the cool leather chairs in the reading room, where they ordered Kingfisher lagers or London Diet beers. It was getting on toward late morning, but it was generally thought to be too early for gin and tonics or adding a shot of rum to the thumbs-up colas. The unexpected cool weather could not change the habits of the Duckworthians. They were used to playing their golf and tennis before 11 in the morning or after 4 in the afternoon. During the midday hours, the members drank or lunched or simply sat under the ceiling fans or in the deep shade of the ladies' garden, which was never exclusively used by or especially full of ladies, not nowadays. Yet the garden's name was unchanged from Purdah times, when the seclusion of women from the sight of men or strangers was practiced by some Muslims and Hindus. Farrokh found this odd, for the founding members of the Duckworth Sports Club were the British, who were still welcome there and even comprised a small proportion of the membership. To Dr. Daruwalla's knowledge, the British had never practiced Purdah. The Duckworth's founders had intended the club for any and all citizens of Bombay, provided that they distinguished themselves in community leadership. As Farrokh and the other members of the membership committee would attest, the definition of community leadership could be argued for the length of the monsoon. By tradition, the chairman of the Duckworth Club was the governor of Maharashtra. Yet, Lord Duckworth himself, for whom the club was named, had never been governor. Lord D, as he was called, had long sought the office, but the eccentricities of his wife were too notorious. Lady Duckworth was afflicted with exhibitionism in general, and with the astonishing wild habit of exposing her breasts in particular. Although this affliction endeared both Lord and Lady Duckworth to many members of the club, it was a gesture thought lacking in gubernatorial merit. Dr. Daruwalla stood in the penetrating cool of the empty dance hall, viewing, as he often did, the splendid and abundant trophies and the spellbinding old photographs of members past. Farrokh enjoyed such controlled sightings of his father and of his grandfather and of the countless avuncular gentlemen among his father's and grandfather's friends. He imagined he could remember every man who had ever laid a hand on his shoulder or touched the top of his head. Dr. Daruwalla's familiarity with these photographs belied the fact that the doctor himself had spent very few of his 59 years in India. During those times when he was a visiting physician in Bombay, Dr. Daruwalla was sensitive to anyone or anything that reminded him of how little he knew or understood the country of his birthplace. The more time he spent in the haven of the Duckworth Club, the more the doctor could sustain the illusion that he was comfortable being in India. In truth, it was only when he was surrounded by the old photos in the dance hall that Farrokh felt at home. Of Lady Duckworth, Dr. Daruwalla had only heard her story. In each of her stunning photographs, her breasts were properly, if not modestly, covered. Yes, a highly elevated and sizable bosom could be detected in her pictures, even when Lady Duckworth was well advanced in years. And yes, her habit of exposing herself supposedly increased as she grew older. Her breasts were reported to be well formed and well worth revealing into her 70s. She'd been 75 when she revealed herself in the club's circular driveway to a horde of young people arriving for the sons and daughters of members' ball. This incident resulted in a multi-vehicle collision. It was reputed to bear responsibility for the enlargement of the speed bumps, which were implanted the entire length of the access road. In Farrokh's opinion, the Duckworth Club was permanently fixed at the speed indicated by those signs posted at both ends of the drive, dead slow. But this, for the most part, contented him. The admonition to go dead slow didn't strike Dr. Daruwalla as an imposition, although the doctor did regret not being alive for at least one glimpse of Lady Duckworth's long-ago breasts. The club couldn't have been dead slow in her day. As he had sighed aloud in the empty dance hall, perhaps 100 times, Dr. Daruwalla sighed again and softly said to himself, "Those were the good old days." But it was only a joke. He didn't really mean it. Those good old days were as unknowable to him as Canada, his cold, adopted country, or as the India he only pretended to be comfortable in. Furthermore, Farrokh never spoke or sighed loudly enough to be heard by anyone else. In the vast, cool hall, he listened. He could hear the waiters and the bus boys in the dining room setting the tables for lunch. He could hear the clicks and thumps of the snooker balls and the flat, authoritative snap of a card turned face up on a table. And although it was now past 11, 2 diehards were still playing tennis by the soft, slowly paced pops of the ball. Dr. Daruwalla concluded that it wasn't a very spirited match. It was unmistakably the head gardener's truck that sped along the access road, hitting each of the speed bumps with abandon. There followed the resounding clatter of hoes and rakes and spades, and then an abstract cursing. The head Mali was a moron. There was a photograph that Farrokh was particularly fond of, and he looked intently at it. Then he closed his eyes so that he might see the picture better. In Lord Duckworth's expression, there was much charity and tolerance and patience. Yet there was something stupefied in his faraway gaze, as if he'd only recently recognized and accepted his own futility. Although Lord Duckworth was broad-shouldered and had a deep chest, and he firmly held a sword, there was also a kind of gentle idiot's resignation at the turned-down corners of his eyes and the drooping ends of his mustache. He was perpetually almost the governor of Maharashtra, but never the governor. And the hand that he placed around Lady Duckworth's girlish waist was clearly a hand that touched her without weight, that held her without strength, if it held her at all. Lord D committed suicide on New Year's Eve, precisely at the turn of the century. For many more years would Lady Duckworth reveal her breasts, but it was agreed that as a widow, although she exposed herself more often, she did so half-heartedly. Cynics said that had she lived and continued to show India her gifts, Lady D might have thwarted independence. In the photograph that so appealed to Dr. Daruwalla, Lady Duckworth's chin was tilted down, her eyes mischievously gazing up, as if she'd just been caught peering into her own thrilling cleavage and had instantly looked away. Her bosom was a broad, strong shelf supporting her pretty face. Even fully clothed, there was something unrestrained about the woman. Her arms hung straight down at her sides, but her fingers were spread wide apart, with her palms presented to the camera as if for crucifixion, and a wild strand of her allegedly blonde hair, which was otherwise held high off her graceful neck, was childishly twisted and coiled like a snake around one of the world's perfect little ears. In future years, her hair turned from blonde to gray without losing its thick body or its deep luster. Her breasts, despite being so often and so long exposed, never sagged. Dr. Daruwalla was a happily married man. However, he would have admitted, even to his dear wife, that he was in love with Lady Duckworth, for he'd fallen in love with her photographs and with her story when he was a child. But it could have a lugubrious effect on the doctor if he spent too much time in the dance hall reviewing the photographs of members past. Most of the members past were deceased. As the circus people said of their dead, they had fallen without a net. Of the living, the expression was reversed. Of Lady Duckworth, at least from her photographs, Farrokh would say that her breasts were still falling in the net. Possibly they were immortal. Thank you. Thanks a lot. I think now you can watch me fall down these stairs and then we sit slightly. Is that what we do, Peter? We go down here? Yeah. All right, okay.
I'll start with a number of questions to Mr. Irving. A Son of the Circus is very much a novel about India. You talked about how you got the idea for the novel, but still the book comes as a surprise after books like The World According to Garp or Ciderhouse Rules or Owen Meany, which are deeply American and are very much about America. Many American themes pop up in it. Why did you stray from America? Why was there this interest for India? Why didn't you put Farrokh in Northern America and tell his story there?
Well, I would disagree that it's a novel about India. Midnight's Children is a novel about India. The main character of Midnight's Children is born on the most important day in modern Indian history. This is a novel about a displaced person. This is a novel about Dr. Daruwalla. It is a novel about his foreignness, his feeling of strangeness and foreignness and not belonging when he goes back to India or where he lives in Canada. So that the subject of the novel is of his displacement. He is the principal point of view character. And as I said in my introduction, it was that image of him in a foreign country, that image of him in the snow in Toronto, and all of the things in his past that had led him there that made me want to write about him. I didn't know when I began how much of the book would be set in India. When I began, I imagined that at least half of the book would take place in Toronto. But I felt that the story in India, his connection with the other characters with whom he crosses paths, is much more interesting than the story of his life in Toronto. And so the book very much lopsidedly came down to those settings and to those landscapes. I wasn't thinking about America. I wasn't thinking about America when I wrote the Ciderhouse Rules. I was thinking about the relationship between a doctor in an orphanage hospital and an orphan he delivers who never gets adopted. And I thought, well, where does this take place? It can only take place where abortion and when abortion is illegal. Therefore, early 20th century United States. I was thinking about, as I told you, the different kinds of victims of the period of Vietnam in the United States. Not only the obvious victims of that war, but the extended family of victims of that wrong-headed policy. And so the subject simply presented itself in the case of Owen Meany. I think that region, location, for me, always comes after story and after character. So that it was because of who Dr. Larch and Homer Wells were as characters that I felt this novel should be set in the 1930s in a very poor, remote region of Maine, the poorest of the New England states. And in the case of Owen Meany, since it was chiefly a book about adolescence, childhood, a childhood friendship, it was easy for me to set it in New Hampshire because my childhood was from New Hampshire and the details were accessible. But I don't think it really mattered so much the setting. In this book, there was Dr. Daruwalla standing on that street corner, and it was his story I was interested in, and I didn't really care where it had to be.
And India sort of crept into it.
India became something I obviously had to learn about. But always from the point of view of what an overwhelmingly foreign place it is to him. I wouldn't never have presumed to write about India from the point of view of a character who was comfortable in India, because I'm not comfortable in India.
You were talking about displacement just now, and Dr. Daruwalla's displacement. Many of your novels are about social issues. I mentioned it just now. Garp was about the sexual revolution, Ciderhouse about abortion, Owen Meany about the degeneration of America. Is Son of the Circus a novel about displacement? Do you consider that a social issue you write about or want to write about?
Well, I don't know that it's a social issue so much as it's a fact of many sophisticated and educated people's lives. I would guess that many of us in this room were born one place, educated in a second place, and you've ended up living in a third or a fourth place or a fifth place after that. I don't think you have to be born in India, educated in Europe, and end up living in North America in order to feel alienated from your surroundings, in order to feel that you don't feel at home when you go home, wherever it is, and that you don't really belong where you've ended up, except you've ended up there. I think this is a fact of the late 20th century. And a century from now, I think there will be more people like Dr. Daruwalla. Now, in the doctor's case, I admit, I sort of stacked the deck against him. He's not merely a man split between 3 continents, but in addition to being Indian-born, he's of a very small minority of Indians. He's a Parsi. There aren't more than 85,000 Parsis in India. Most of them are in Bombay, and the number is going down. because the Parsis are traveling, they're moving away. In addition to this isolation, to this minority group that he comes from, his father is an atheist. It's not true that every Parsi is a practicing Zoroastrian, but to be the kind of extreme atheist that Dr. Daruwalla's father is a further means of isolating him from a sense of place. I choose his age for a very obvious reason. I wanted him to be of an age when he is sent away to school before India reaches independence, so that he misses it. He's the opposite of the character in Midnight's Children. He's not a Midnight's child. He goes. He's not there. Where does he go? He goes to Austria. What is Austria when he goes there? It's divided in 4 parts. It's occupied by 4 foreign countries. When does he leave Austria? He leaves Austria just before Austria gets its independence. So that he goes all the way through medical school, right? He goes all the way through medical school without ever having lived in a country that is its own country. And then what he does is he marries an Austrian woman and moves to Canada. So that, and of course there's the business of his conversion to Christianity, which turns out to be a fraud, which turns out to be a fake. He's kind of tricked into his conversion. So I have done as many things to him to isolate him from a community as possible. I've exaggerated his alienation, but again, I don't think that I think if I don't want to ask for a show of hands, but I would imagine if I said how many of you feel alienated from where you were born and where you live now, I think we'd have quite a number of hands in the air. I don't think it's, especially for a writer, I think alienation is a rather common thing to feel, and it's for that reason that I didn't want him to be a real or a successful writer, because I think if he were, he'd be more comfortable with his alienation than he is. But he's a doctor, he's a part of a community, and yet he doesn't feel that he's a part of that community.
You could say then, and it sounds horrible if I say it, but you could say that there is a lesson in A Son of the Circus then, something like we're all going to be displaced persons, and you could also say that there are some lessons in, let's say, the Ciderhouse rules, where there is a sort of, well, a very strong plea for at least a choice for abortion, pro-choice, as it's called in America. Do you consider yourself a didactic writer, a moralist perhaps, as, for example, Charles Dickens could be described?
I think there's a difference between being didactic and being a moralist. I would say that I would say that there is always a moral spine, a moral core to my novels. There is always a sense of right doing and wrong doing, but of the novels I've written, I think only the Ciderhouse Rules and A Prayer for Owen Meany are didactic. They very definitely are didactic books. They take a particular point of view and they don't equivocate it. A Prayer for Owen Meany has a very negative view of the 60s, of that decade. It is a very hard and angry and cynical view of that decade and how everyone with hindsight reimagines what that decade was. The Ciderhouse Rules does not offer a balanced view of abortion rights. It's a didactic novel. But this is this novel is more of a Dr. Daruwalla's state of mind is a fact of life. He comes to the conclusion at the age of 62 or 63 that that his story is, as he puts it, the opposite of universal. That his story is merely strange. That his story is perpetually foreign, and that his foreignness is something he carries with him. I think if he were an intellectual man, if he were an artist, he might realize that his very sense of foreignness is universal. But he's not that kind of man. He's a community man, and he's not a part of a community. He's not an intellectual.
Let's talk about another main character in A Son of the Circus, a very strange one, Rahul, the transsexual serial killer. You can't get much more eccentric than that, probably.
Oh, I don't know.
You can always try in the
Sure
next
you can.
book. Yeah. The serial killer is a very popular theme in American film and American literature. Why are Americans so fascinated by the serial killers? Or perhaps I should ask, why are you fascinated by serial killers? Or by this serial killer?
Well, the fascinating thing for the purpose of a novel about a serial killer is that they're very hard to catch.
Takes a long time, you mean?
I'm not trying to make fun of your question, but it's like, it reminds me of the question of why do you write about orphans? Why do orphans attract you? And I say, well, I write long novels, okay? If you can eliminate the mother and the father, you save yourself a lot of room. You can just begin with the damn orphan, right? And don't think that Dickens didn't know that. There are practical reasons for writing about an orphan. You eliminate a lot of boring background to a lot of boring novels. What was his mother like? What was his father like? When I don't write about orphans, I have a tendency towards single parents. It's half as many characters, okay? And if the parents aren't the main character, why bother with them? Now, the story in A Son of the Circus is that Dr. Daruwalla, by coincidence, is the medical examiner of the first two victims of this killer. I want him never to imagine in that 20-year period of time that the victims of this killer are repeated in such high numbers over the ensuing 20 years. I want that discovery to be after the discovery of the first murder victim that you, the reader, comes to. First, you don't even know it's a murder victim. You think there's an old man who has had a heart attack on a golf course. Then you find out he's been clubbed with a putter. Then you find out that he's probably the 69th of what will be 70 killings. There are many things that are in novels for the sake of the story. And I would say that for Rahul to have killed only two people doesn't contribute very much to keeping the story going. So that I'm giving you a practical answer here. I do not share my countrymen's obsession with serial killing. Also, the largest number of serial killings on record happened in the former Soviet Union, not in the United States. That is the serial killer of record, at least as far as we know. But furthermore, the interest in Rahul was, I've written about, as you mentioned in your introduction, I'd written about a transsexual before, and in my limited experience with transsexuals, I don't know many transsexuals, but I know some. And I would say that among them are some of the bravest and most sure of themselves and well-centered individuals I know. To make a decision of that magnitude, you have to know more about yourself, or think you know more about yourself, than the rest of us ever have to ask ourselves. It's an enormously difficult undertaking, and you better know why you're doing it. And so, among the limited number of transsexuals I know, I can think of a couple of people who I think are the nicest and most well-adjusted people I've ever known in my life. I can also think of a couple of people who are the most fucked up people I've ever met. Because don't think for a minute that the decision to change your sex necessarily changes all your problems. If it happens to change your problems, you've made a very fortunate choice. If it hasn't changed your problems, if it hasn't changed your attitude, what do you do then? So that the decision to make Raoul a transsexual is not whimsical. It is a way of undermining his conviction and exacerbating what is already an angry man, and turning him into a very angry woman. And from again, from who I know and from what I've read, there's no generalization. You can't make a generalization and say that transsexuals are successful and happy people, or that they're crazy and unhappy people. What you say about them is what you say about the rest of us. That there are some very happy and successful people, and there's some very crazy and unhappy people. If Roberta Muldoon was a successful transsexual, surely Raoul is not.
No. She's evil. There's a lot of evil in A Son of the Circus. Actually, there's a lot of evil in your books. And the evil in your books often has to do with sex and lust. Is lust the root of all evil, as Jenny Fields, the mother of Garp, would say?
That's what Jenny would say, but no, I don't think that that's the case at all. Lust, let me again speak as the stage director, as the storyteller. There are certain things in stories that stop your life completely and take over your story. Sexual desire is one of those things. One thing that you can count upon lust in a story is that it will change the story. It makes things happen, right? It makes things happen. The death of parents or other loved ones makes things happen in a story. It's not by accident that death of loved ones plays such a principal part in most novels of any scope and seriousness. A violent and surprising accident plays a similar role in novels. Think of the things that can happen to you in your life that completely derail, change the routine of your life. A sudden, overwhelming sexual desire, the death of someone you love, a violent and unexpected accident. Well, there are other things, but these things instantly make a story. They change a story. They stop the story that was and begin a new story every time. They are a foolproof transition to motion. A missing person, that's a good one too. And one of the oldest sort of comic routines that I know in A Son of the Circus, twins separated at birth. Okay? The possibilities for mistaken identity and the anticipation for eventual meeting are obvious, right? A dead body on a golf course, you see, is another one. Who is he? What happened to him? I mean, there are certain things that can be counted upon to sort of interrupt the action to that point and change the direction of all the characters on the stage. So that I don't want you to think that I am particularly interested in orphans, lust, transsexuals, but they seem to have gotten your attention.
Let's change the subject.
Yeah.
You write big books, large books. Should a book be big to be convincing, or will a book be more convincing as it's getting bigger? Is there more scope for the...
I don't think conviction is a matter of size in novels or in books. But I do think that you have to be truthful to what interests you in the structure, in the architecture of a story. If you're interested in plot, which I am, if you're interested not in the king dies and then the queen dies, but the king dies and the queen dies of grief, that old definition, right? If you're interested in one thing happening because of another thing, and if you're interested in the crossed paths of characters starting from different directions and different places and different times in a story, what D.H. Lawrence called, what he said of the novel is that it is the subtlest form of the interconnectedness of things. Now, most of us don't have very connected lives. We don't, thank goodness, run into our first boyfriends and first girlfriends every 5 or 6 years. People who were in our life once don't keep coming back. But one of the pleasures of writing a novel, and for me reading a novel, is that everything is connected to everything else. You can make this realistic, but this is not reality. It's not the same thing. Realism in the novel is not the same as reality or real life. It is the writer's responsibility to make details authentic, feel authentic, seem realistic. But the sheer coincidence of this character 500 pages later connecting with that character, that's a story. That's not real life. And either you're interested in that rather old-fashioned form of the fable or the story, or you have a kind of plotless preference for a short modern confrontation, a fragmented story, a disconnected story. There's plenty of good literature of that kind. I read it, I just don't happen to write it. I am attracted, anyone who's attracted to the connected story, the character who you meet in the first 15 pages and who goes away, who disappears. And then you meet another character who disappears, who goes away. And then you start a third story, which is unconnected to the first two, which stops, which ends for 400 pages before it picks up again. Those are the kind of things that plot can do, and those are the kind of things that are better if they're longer. They're better if they're longer. But they're not every reader's taste, and they're not every writer's choice. Why should they be? It happens to be, it happens right now to be mine. A more specific example, I think, is that a more specific structural obsession of mine lately, which I've been talking about in interviews the last couple of days, is that I'm particularly interested in the last 3 novels, The Ciderhouse Rules, A Prayer for Owen Meany, and A Son of the Circus, in a story which moves the reader in more than one direction at the same time. In other words, these 3 novels are not told chronologically. They do not begin at the beginning. They all begin about 3/4 of the way through the story. And you move very slowly forward in the story, while you move very quickly backward in the story, so that the flashbacks are quickly paced and huge, and the forward story actually has a very short distance to travel. The Son of the Circus begins only a few days before it ends. 600 and some odd pages later. But in the meantime, you've got to go back 20 years and find out what happened 20 years ago and what happened 15 years ago. Owen Meany doesn't begin with the earliest childhood friendship between Johnny Wheelwright and Owen Meany. It begins with Owen Meany killing Johnny Wheelwright's mother, which is a long way into the story. The Ciderhouse Rules doesn't begin with what makes Dr. Larch decide to be an abortionist. It begins with the birth of the orphan and how many times he's adopted and sent back. So that each of these stories requires a flashback that in time and in space is longer than the forward story. So that you take 2 steps ahead and 5 long steps back. 2 steps ahead, 5 long steps back. You're moving in 2 directions at once. Now, The World According to Garp and the Hotel New Hampshire weren't written that way. They were written in strict chronological order. And after those 2 books, I wanted to restructure the way in which the reader receives the material. And now I feel very satisfied with these last 3 novels, but I also feel I've been doing that now for a number of years, since 1981. And I think it's time to go back to the chronological order and see whether or not I find anything new or interesting in that order of storytelling, which I haven't written in that order of storytelling since the end of the 70s. You see? So the kind of considerations that I have almost inevitably end with a long novel because I'm interested in the connected story. And I don't know how a plotted novel can be very short, at least, and not be and be very interesting. And not to be very interesting, and I don't see it. There is perhaps the greatest exception to what I just said is in my view the 2 great novels by Graham Greene, The Heart of the Matter and The Power and the Glory. Which are very brilliantly plotted novels, but relatively short. And Great Expectations, which is among Dickens's most complexly plotted novels, is, although a long novel by today's standards, not a long novel by Dickens's standards. It's, I would guess, I don't have it in front of me, but I would guess it's less than half the length of David Copperfield, not even as long as Oliver Twist, and probably a third of the length of Bleak House.
I've got one last question.
I don't think about length, you see.
Which ties in with Graham Greene in a way, and is supposed to be a topical question. Tomorrow it's Nobel Prize Day. The winner of the Nobel Prize 1994 will be announced. Dutchmen who annex Flanders hope that it's going to be Hugo Claus who wins, who's very high noted. Who would you like to give the Nobel Prize if you were on the committee? Or in other words, who is the writer you admire most? And that's a living writer, because Greene, who is dead and regrettably never got the Nobel Prize, isn't there anymore.
Well, the fact that Greene never got the Nobel Prize has, I must say, discredited the Nobel Prize for me. It is discredited the Nobel Prize, and I don't know how the Nobel Prize can recover from that obvious.
By giving it to you, perhaps.
No, for that obvious insult. I think that the Nobel Prize, in other things, has been consistently more meaningful than it has been in literature. I certainly think that some of the in my conscious lifetime, that is, in the time that I've been a writer and have been aware of who gets the Nobel Prize, I would have to say that the recipients are too various to give the prize any credibility whatsoever. I mean, it's been given to some absolutely wonderful writers and to some thoroughly second-rate writers.
Churchill.
And you can't you can't keep the credibility of a prize in existence if you show so much whimsy and politics in the decision of giving it. So frankly, if you want to ask me who my favorite writers are, that's a question I'm happy to respond to. But I frankly think that the Nobel Prize is mixed company, and it's not to say that someone in recent memory has won the Nobel Prize. Might mean that they're a very good writer, and it might mean that they're given something they never deserved, because that's the way it's gone. You know, it's not. I don't know. You see, I don't have the list in front of me, and I can't tell you that it was never serious or never. It never had a uniformity of literary standard. That may well be the case. Someone may well say, "Well, there's nothing new. It's always been like that." And I can certainly think of some distant writers who don't seem to me to be of very great quality who have been given that prize. But certainly lately, it's a crapshoot, as we say in the United States. It's who's paying whom, and it's which country's turn it is, and
it's a very bleak view.
You know, it's not serious. I tend, of course, to like storytellers who are narrative and plot oriented and labyrinthine in their structure. I don't think my list of favorite writers is going to surprise anybody, that is among living people, because they all have decidedly a 19th century, many 19th century habits among them.
Marquez.
Garcia Marquez.
Nobel Prize winner.
Günter Grass. Günter Grass is the first contemporary writer I read when I was in university that I liked. In other words, I was strictly 19th century in my taste, and then I read The Tin Drum and thought that, oh, this can happen here too. It was a very sort of important book for me. But Grass and Garcia Marquez, Salman Rushdie, Robertson Davies. One thing that should come as no surprise about these names is that they tend to the long story with a big cast of characters, and they're all comic. They're all comic. That's no coincidence either. I mean, a strong reason for my fondness for those writers I've mentioned is that they're very funny. They're extremely funny. Obviously that has a great effect on me. You know.
Well, we've taken up almost all the time, I'm afraid, but there is still time for a few questions, I guess, from the audience. So, if the first one will step up.
Dr. Daruwalla, but his wife objectively had just as much reason to feel that displacement didn't seem to. So subjectively, she was experiencing it differently. Is there some characteristic about her that would bring that about, maybe?
Did everybody hear the question?
The question about a son of the circus is that Dr. Daruwalla, who we've been saying is Indian-born, seems to feel his displacement, his alienation, very keenly, whereas his wife, who is also a foreigner, both in India and in Canada, she's European, doesn't seem to feel this displacement to any degree at all. She seems to find it. She never mentions it. She never talks about it. Am I rephrasing the question correctly? Well, the principal reason for that, perhaps I should have mentioned it in the book, but I felt that it was apparent, is that Julia is white. Well, but in India, it doesn't bother her that she feels foreign because she expects to feel foreign. It bothers Dr. Daruwalla that he feels foreign because he was born there. And he still doesn't know what's going on. He doesn't know what's happening. He's completely been cut off. And so I think we have to understand that his feeling of displacement in India is slightly different than his feeling when he's in Canada. In Canada, he's also acutely aware of a racial suspicion that he undergoes because he is, in the phrase that most journalists use, a visible minority. Julia is not a visible minority. She is among, you might say, those very successful white immigrants from Europe who made their way to North America both before and after the war, and whose assimilation in North America has largely been very successful. But the same cannot be said of immigrants of color. They are not as readily assimilated there or as well treated. And so it seems to me that Julia is not, she doesn't agonize over feeling like a foreigner in India because she expects to. And in Canada, she blends in, but her husband doesn't. And that's a matter of race at the North American end of the story.
Another question? Could you stand up, please?
Some of the most interesting characters in your books, for example, the Owen Meany and also the Hajiras and whatnot. I think they're so interesting because they're three-dimensional. You have no sympathy for these people who are so committed to their purpose. And I think one of the reasons you have no sympathy for them is because they're extreme. Do you use these people or devices to bring up ideas of fundamentalism, extremism in general, people's beliefs that you think are crazy?
Not consciously, but I'd agree. Did everyone hear the question? Okay. I'll do my best. The question points out extreme characters such as the Ellen Jamesians in The World According to Garp, and the Hydras in A Son of the Circus, that cult of transsexuals in India who ritualistically self-emasculate themselves. There are 5,000 of these people in Bombay alone, and that may be too large a number to relegate to as minority a word as cult. There's quite a number of them. There, I would say that the Ellen Jamesians are more of a cult. But the question is, these people are written about largely without sympathy. I dispute that to some degree. But do I do this to express my own ideas about such extreme positions as, say, religious fundamentalism? Am I doing a good job? Is that pretty clear? Well, I think that extreme beliefs, extreme systems of beliefs, violently radical behavior in the case of both the Hydras and the Ellen Jamesians, we're talking about self-mutilation. In the Ellen Jamesians case for reasons of extreme political sympathy. In the case of the Hydras, it's religious, and it's also the desire to make themselves a recognized third gender, which they are to a large degree so recognized in India. I'm not conscious of baiting other groups by the creation of these groups. I am certainly conscious of withholding sympathy from such physically violent acts, even to yourself. It seems to me that to cut out your tongues, to protest the dismemberment by other people of a rape victim, is, if you remember the story, not even what the rape victim wanted. And I have to confess that most of my introduction to the Hydras in India was from the point of view of an Indian doctor, and from the point of view of a doctor, to cut off your balls and your penis with a single stroke, to cauterize the wound with hot oil, so that the resultant scar resembles a vagina, is, to be kind, not surgically recommended. So I don't feel, shall we say, although my sympathy for the misfit and for the unwanted has been noted in various writings about my books, I don't know that it extends to every extremist act. But I don't usually use one action by one group to represent another group. In other words, if I wanted to say something about religious fundamentalists, I would write about one. You see what I mean? I wouldn't write about a Hydra and sort of pass a Hydra off as a religious fundamentalist. Well, you make me sound, just to repeat, the argument is reiterated that I seem lacking in sympathy for extremists. Okay.
That's it. I think
I guess so.
I think there is room for one more question, actually. Oh. Well, that makes it two, I guess.
Yeah.
Are you more careful in what you write these days after what's happened to Salman Rushdie and now the Bangladeshi writer?
The question is, am I more careful about what I write because of what's happened to Salman Rushdie or most recently the Bangladeshi writer? Certainly not consciously so, but I think that if I would be I don't think it was for what happened to Salman so much as for reasons of being myself the foreigner in India, that in the case of A Son of the Circus, I was conscious of causing offense only to my own, which is to say, if there is any religious group who would take offense at A Son of the Circus, they would be Christians. The only fun I have at the expense of a religious group in A Son of the Circus is at the expense of Christians. I don't know, to tell you the truth, how conscious I was of. It's not that kind of book, among other things. The issue of religion or religious fundamentalism doesn't play much of a part in the story of a man whose father was an atheist and whose own religious feelings are terribly vague. There's no. I guess I'm not of the right. I'm not in a position where I find it hard to imagine who I could offend in the way that Salman has caused offense. The dedication to the novel, which you may know is to him, but this is not a symbolic dedication. This is not a political dedication. This is a dedication to him because we're old friends, because I knew him before he was published. I read Midnight's Children when it was a manuscript, and I wouldn't presume to set a novel in his hometown without tipping my hat to him. I wrote him about this book when it was in progress. We've talked about it. All of the dedications in my books are personal. I mean, to friends or family. So I don't think I'm of the world or in the world where I'm conscious of having to take that care. Maybe I'm missing a precedent here. Maybe I could be struck down by a bunch of angry Jesuits as I leave the building tonight. But it isn't in my understanding of the Jesuitical tradition. It is not likely that although I may have irritated a Jesuit or two with the portrait of Martin Mills in A Son of the Circus, it's not likely any one of them would give me more than a good talking to. You see what I mean? It's not my it's not my world. I did have some very friendly letters from transsexuals after the portrait of Roberta Muldoon in The World According to Garp, and I would be surprised if I did not have some unfriendly letters from transsexuals after the portrait of Raoul in A Son of the Circus. But these things are I don't know. It's I think there isn't a writer with an audience with an audience of any size who hasn't had hate mail or sort of a few scary, threatening confrontations. But what's happened to Salman is truly is a tragedy, and it's horrible. I mean, it's that kind of and he's not alone in what's happened to him. He's just particularly well known among the writers to whom that's happened. I'm not in the world or writing of the world where it seems to me I'm giving that kind of offense. But anyone who is even marginally popular makes individual enemies. This isn't the same thing as the fatwa.